Angelo, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Will, and good morning to everyone in Rome, and good afternoon, good morning, good evening to all those joining by video conference, as is the case of myself. Welcome to the panel 5 of our conference on implementation of secure transaction reforms in the agricultural sector. This is a panel that, for various reasons, is very dear to me, not only because it brings back beautiful memories of my days in Rome, and also beautiful memories of my youth growing up in a cattle ranch in Brazil, but particularly because I think it provides a very good and useful example of how instruments produced by different organizations or promoted by different organizations can be integrated in overall secure transactions and access to credit policy to promote one particular economic sector. For that, I have to congratulate Ignacio for having put together a very good panel of excellent speakers that will provide this integrated overview. Each of them would have about 15 minutes for their presentations, and I will introduce all of them at the beginning. Not all of them, and probably none of them, would have needed an introduction, but I'd still like to point it out so that they are known for those, the few of you who not have been so familiar with any of them. There's been a slight order in the change in the order of speakers. We'll be starting with Teemu Viinikainen. Teemu is a legal consultant at FAO Development Law Service. He has been working for FAO for many years and also contributed to work of UNIDROIT. And you set the scene, so to speak, to our panel discussion about agricultural supply chains and needs for financing, and then moving on to contract farming as a credit vehicle. He'll be followed by Panos Varangis. Panos is currently the legal head, the global lead for agricultural finance, agricultural insurance in the finance, competitiveness, and innovation global practice of the World Bank Group. Prior to that, he led the IFC's work and advised financial institutions to provide financial services to SMEs, agribusiness, and farmers. He would be focusing on pre-harvest financing and the role of crop receipts. The third speaker is Philine Wehling. Philine, as we all know, is a legal officer at UNIDROIT. She had also experience with the FAO before joining UNIDROIT. She has written about water rights, and she's a wonderful testimony for my successor's fantastic ability of attracting young talent to continue the beautiful work of UNIDROIT. She will talk about post-harvest financing and warehouse receipts. The final speaker of our panel will be Marek Dubovec. We know Marek. Marek is present in the room, but still he's a director of law reform program at the International Law Institute, ILI, adjunct professor at the University of Arizona. And he'll be talking about opportunities to increase access to finance to support agribusiness and overall food security, and also make practical remarks from his experience in supporting law reform in this area. So that, without further ado, and thanking all the speakers for having joined us, I now pass the floor to Teemu. Teemu, please.
Thank you so much for the introductory words. As mentioned, I'm Teemu Viinikainen. I'm an international legal consultant working with the Development Law Service of the Food and Agriculture Organization headquartered here in Rome. So I'm very pleased to have been invited to this 5th conference on the international coordination of secured transactions reform. And as was mentioned in the introduction, in my brief remarks, I will be talking a little bit about the very early part of the agricultural production chain, the challenges that particularly smallholder farmers have in accessing finance, and how certain instruments, and the example of contract farming that I will be using today, can be used to provide financing before the agricultural production takes place. So before any seeds are planted, before any animals are bought, there is need for financing. How do we solve that? So in my presentation, I will have a few topics that I want to touch upon. I will start with a very brief introduction to the office that I represent before I move on to the subject matter of itself. For those who might not be familiar with contract farming, I have a brief slide just to give you the contextual background. before I move on to the meat of my short intervention. That is to show how we have seen that this can be used to get access to credit for smallholder farmers. And then I have a few key resources that I want to leave you with in case you want to dig into more to this topic that I have time in this brief 10 to 15-minute presentation. So LEGEN, or the Development Law Service of the Food and Agriculture Organization, FAO, is a part of the legal office of FAO. And we have quite a unique mandate on what we are tasked to do. So within the organization, we have the responsibility to provide legislative support to all the members of FAO to both analyze their existing legal frameworks on all of the topics that are connected to the overall mandate of FAO in relation to food and agriculture throughout the whole supply chain from farm to fork, to loan EU terminology then. In this work, we are always aligning ourselves to these principles that you can see on the right side of the slide, where we always try to work in very close participation, collaboration, not only with the members, the governments of our members, but also their civil society organizations, particularly farmers and their organizations, as everything that we do at the legislative level will inevitably affect their lives for better, hopefully, or for worse sometimes. The second topic of area that we cover is capacity development, and that we undertake through various workshops, various exercises, various activities that we undertake at both local, national, regional, and global level. And finally, our third area of expertise is contributing to the available legal information on areas of importance to food and agriculture organization. We do this with two different ways. We host key legal databases. FAOLEX is one of our flagship products. That is the world's largest repository of legislation and policies that are related to food and agriculture. But we also are active in the research sphere. And some of our work that I can use as examples is the projects that we do together with UNIDROIT. And since already more than 10 years now, we've been working with UNIDROIT on a number of projects, starting with legal guide and contract farming, which is what I'm going to be talking today, and continuing currently on a number of different projects, such as that on the legal structures for agricultural enterprises. So these are the three things that our office provides for both our sister departments in FAO, but more importantly, to our member countries. With this as a background, I will just say a few words about what we mean when we talk about contract farming, for those who might not be as intimately familiar with it. Contract farming is simply a form of agricultural production that is undertaken under a forward agreement. So in this agreement, the parties, usually a farmer or a farmer's organization on one side, and a buyer in whichever shape or form they may come, such as we have listed there processors, traders, also public institutions. They come together and they negotiate an agreement that will guide the way the agricultural production will take place. And they usually enter into it before such production happens. So practically how it works is that these two parties come together. They agree on what the farmer should produce, what quality it should be, what are the specific characteristics of the agricultural product that are important for the buyer, and when this should be delivered, but also on key terms like how it should be paid for, what is going to be the price, as well as all of those more legal aspects on what should happen in a case of force majeure, how do you deal with remedies, how is the contract terminated, so on and so forth. These, for us to consider a agricultural production to fall under what we call contract farming, it would have to operate under a contract. And such a contract can either be a written one or an oral one, although of course us with the legal background are always promoting the use of the written contracts for the increased clarity, as well as for the usability to make use of the contract farming as a credit vehicle, as I will talk in just a second. So to understand why people would want to partake in this kind of arrangement, I'll just mention the key benefits for both parties. Because by entering into an agreement, the farmers who often are struggling not only to access credit, but also to access markets after they have finished their production cycle, if they have this contract in advance, they know that come September, all of my peas will be delivered to the local buyer who will pay a certain price for them. So they have knowledge of the final market who will buy their products. And this knowledge will help them to invest in their production in advance. And for the buyer, the corresponding benefit is that they know to a certain degree of specificity how much they are going to receive of which product and of which quality, which allows them to further plan their activities down the line so that they too can be more aware of their needs and they know when they're expecting different products in the chain. With this understanding, I will now talk a little bit about the credit vehicle function, as we call of contract farming. I was mentioning earlier very briefly that it is a well-known fact that particularly smallholder farmers are both resource poor and risk averse, meaning that they are unlikely to be able to afford commercial agricultural production with the resources they have, but due to the unpredictable nature of agricultural production, they are also unlikely to try to secure loans without some kind of fallback position to have, because they know that if anything goes wrong, they won't be able to pay back those loans and they will be back off worse than they were before. What we have seen is that contract farming provides a possible solution to this conundrum. And it does so through two different ways that can, of course, be interconnected in various methods. The most simple way through which this kind of contractual arrangement can be used to get access to credit to farmers is if in the contract itself, the parties agree that the buyer, who usually has a much stronger position, much bigger economies of scale, thank you so much, will be able to provide certain of the key inputs to the farmer itself. So it is possible that the buyer would be purchasing the seeds, the pesticides, the fertilizers, or the day-old chicks, or whatever are the inputs that the farmer is lacking and what they need in order to undertake the agricultural production. Another way for the buyer to do this is simply providing credit. They simply provide a financing option for the producer to purchase these inputs from a third party. The way this is usually financed is that at the moment before the production begins, these are provided to the farmer without any advance payments. So farmer gets access to these without having to be able to afford them in advance, uses them to undertake their agricultural production, and when they deliver their goods to the buyer, at that point from the final price, they deduct the cost of these inputs and they can continue moving forward. So this is a very straightforward way that can work to get these resource poor farmers access to the inputs and credit that they need to do agricultural production. Another way in which contract farming can be used as a credit vehicle is to use the contract, particularly the written contract, as a kind of a business plan to increase the creditworthiness of these farmers towards third-party credit providers. One of the challenges that we've observed and we've learned about is that financing institutions are unlikely to provide financing to smallholder farmers, often because they lack these kinds of business plans. There is no clarity on their creditworthiness, and they present a sizable risk, and they're also very small scale. So the financing that they need is very small, which is unfeasible to do for commercial banks, and microcredit lenders are few and far between. But with the help of this contract, where the farmer can use the future revenues as a proof of their creditworthiness, let's say, they can, rather than pledging a right over their land or production, as they otherwise might have to take to secure a loan for themselves, they can provide in certain systems a lien over the future revenues of this agricultural production contract, of this contract farming arrangement. And this can be useful in facilitating their access to credit. Another way is to in a long-term trust-based relationship, is to have the buyer step in as a guarantor for the loan that the agricultural producers, the farmers, need to undertake the commercial agriculture. But, and this is a wider point that is not just limited to contract farming, there are major risks involved in providing sizable loans and credit to agricultural producers. Unfortunately, particularly at the smallholder level, the risks of agricultural production are immense. There are always chances of unpredictable events happening. There are, even with the best practices, even if you have the access to credit, you get the loan, you get the inputs, you do everything right, a flood comes, it flushes off your crop, a wildfire burns down your production facilities. You are no longer able to complete your production cycle. You are no longer able to sell the product, and you are no longer able to pay back the credit that you had acquired. And since these are often resourceful families, resourceful farmers, they may not have the kind of bank they need, the personal savings to cover this, leading to levels of indebtedness, leading to potentially worse off than they were before. So this is just to raise a little bit of a warning that when we deal with the, particularly at the smallest scale of farming, the risks are very great that even the best intentions may turn ill-advised. This doesn't mean that we shouldn't work for the financing. It just means that when it's done, there needs to be layers of safety nets so that a single mistake, a single error doesn't doom the families or the farmers' livelihood. That's more or less the couple of points I wanted to mention. I just flag a few of our key publications in relation to contract farming, as well as other work that we've done that might be relevant for the conference. I already alluded to our collaboration with UNIDROIT and also with IFAD that resulted in the publication of the legal guide on contract farming in 2015. This legal guide goes into much greater detail to the legal and contractual sides of this relationship. It covers the whole life cycle of a contract farming arrangement, from the negotiation all the way to termination. And it has dedicated sections on access to credit, and it has ways to try to mitigate the risks that I was mentioning, but that I don't unfortunately have time to dig into today. And we're still using it daily in our efforts to work on this field. The second product that I flag here is prepared in collaboration with the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and it is in relation to warehouse receipt legislation, which is another potential financial tool to support at this stage of the agri-food supply chain. And in this publication, we provide guidance on the legislative reforms that might be useful for this area. And we are aware and we are keenly looking forward to the work that UNIDROIT and UNCITRAL are doing on the model law on warehouse receipt legislation, on warehouse receipts. And we're sure that it's going to provide a very important contribution to this thorny topic of how do we get the finance to those that need it the most. But that's the end of my presentation. I believe I'm roughly within the 15 minutes. And I leave just the contact details if you want to learn more on this topic, or if you have other queries that we don't have time to get in today's panel. That's thank you from me, and back over to you, Professor Faria.
Thank you very much, Teemu, for this very interesting and comprehensive presentation on the work of FAO and your department with the special emphasis on contract farming. I understand that Panos, our next speaker, has had some difficulty connecting. So perhaps with a view to allowing for him to solve the problems and not wasting time, I would then invite Philine to step in now and make her presentation. Philine, please.
Thank you very much, Angelo. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, as the case may be. So we just heard from Teemu about contract farming as one instrument to facilitate access to credit pre-harvest. I will now focus on post-harvest financing and present our current joint project with UNCITRAL to develop a model on warehouse receipts. This project really illustrates an example of ex-ante international coordination of legal reform in the field of agriculture finance. Regarding the outline for today's presentation, I will first introduce how the project integrates within UNIDROIT's areas of work, to then look at the progress, working method, and objectives of this project. Third, we will review the scope of the future model, and lastly, I will say a few words about the next steps under the project. Let's first look at how the project fits within UNIDROIT's work program. As you're all very familiar with the part on the left hand of the slide, UNIDROIT's work in secure transactions, I will not address it. You can see some examples of instruments dating back to 1988. When we look at the right hand of the slide, UNIDROIT's work in the field of agriculture, we can first of all observe that this work stream is much more recent. The first instrument developed was the Guide on Contract Farming, adopted in 2015, that was just presented by our colleague Teemu. Upon this successful collaboration with FAO and IFAD, two further projects followed under this partnership related to agricultural land investment contracts and legal structure of agricultural enterprise. Turning now to the model on warehouse receipts, this really connects both areas of work. It draws upon UNIDROIT's expertise in secure transactions and takes account of the specific context of agriculture finance and agricultural supply chains. So what motivated this project? On the one hand, the importance of warehouse receipts and supply chain financing has been growing, especially in agriculture. A warehouse receipt system enables agricultural producers to access credit by borrowing against receipts that are issued for their goods stored in warehouses that are independently controlled warehouses. So despite this growing importance, a number of jurisdictions are lacking an enabling legal framework, be it because there is no legislation in place at all, or there is, but it is not up to date with the needs and developments of the sector, such as, for instance, the increasing digitalization. And indeed, this recently motivated several countries to initiate legal reform in order to contemplate the issuance and transfer of electronic warehouse receipts, which proved to be a major challenge for legislators. Further, the level of harmonization and compatibility of warehouse receipt legislation across jurisdictions is low, although harmonization would facilitate transactions in warehouse receipts cross-border. And despite all of the foregoing, there is no international legal instrument specifically on warehouse receipts or other harmonized legislative guidance at the international level that would support and coordinate these legal reform efforts. And all of these findings motivated UNCITRAL to propose to UNIDROIT in 2019 to consider joint work on the topic. So as a first step, both organizations invited a multidisciplinary group of experts to assess the feasibility and potential benefits of formulating legislative guidance on warehouse receipt finance, which the expert group proved, the feasibility and potential benefits. Not approved, confirmed. The project was then approved to be included in UNIDROIT's current work program as a high priority project. In terms of the working methods, the working group was established to develop the model law consistent with UNIDROIT's practice. So this drafting process by the working group mirrors that at national level, and that it follows a participatory approach involving relevant public and private sector stakeholders. Beyond that, in view of the international nature of the model law, the group also includes experts representing all major legal traditions and geographical regions, in addition to organizations active in the field of agri-finance reform. So this illustrates this coordinated effort for legal reform between experts and organizations that have been contributing to this project. What are the objectives? The purpose of the project is twofold. It shall support legal reform in order to help modernizing national laws and to help increasing international harmonization between those laws. And to this purpose, two texts are being prepared. One is a set of black letter rules on the private law aspects of warehouse receipt systems. This is conceptualized as a standalone law that would be implemented as primary legislation. And that is what I mean when I refer to a model law. Now, the rules of this model law are drafted in a way that they are consistent with international instruments on related areas of law. Most notably here, the UNCITRAL model laws on electronic transferable records and that on secure transactions. The rules also need to be compatible with existing legal frameworks at the national level. And this is particularly challenging when working at the international level because you do not have this legal framework reference that you use in order to tailor a new draft law or legal reforms to a set of legal notions, concepts, etc. But you need to find a more abstract way using jurisdiction neutral language and accommodating, for example, here formats of warehouse receipts that are used across jurisdictions. I refer to the single and dual format of warehouse receipts. And lastly, the rules are also drafted in a technology neutral way in order to accommodate the use of various technologies for the issuance and transfer of electronic warehouse receipts, including technologies that might emerge even in the future. So the second text that is being developed is a guide to enactment to facilitate the implementation of the model law at country level. It will include commentary and illustrations on how these provisions of the model law would be applied, how they relate to the broader legal framework of a particular country. And it will also importantly provide guidance for drafting the implementing subsidiary legislation for the model law. If we take a closer look at the scope of the model law, it will cover the private law aspects of warehouse receipt systems in a comprehensive manner with a focus on the financing function of receipts. So it will set out the scope of the law and the definitions. Now, the scope is not limited to agriculture products, but agriculture is the major application case of this piece of legislation. The provisions will also address the format and medium of warehouse receipts, their content requirements, contractual rights and obligations of the parties as far as they are necessary, required by the instrument itself. It will also provide for the registration of receipts upon their issuance. Continuing with the scope, it will address negotiability and transfer of warehouse receipts, that is the sale and use as collateral. Amendments to warehouse receipts after the issuance. It will address substitution and removal of goods from the warehouse and termination of storage, and to a limited extent, aspects concerning creation and third-party effectiveness of a security right in warehouse receipts and stored goods, as well as relevant priority enforcement related issues. So the extent to which these aspects concerning security rights will be addressed in the model law has not conclusively been decided yet by the working group. One approach could be to not include these aspects in the model law itself, but leave it to the general secure transactions law of a given country to deal with those. Another approach would be to include some provisions, a kind of minimum standard provisions, which would be particularly useful for those countries that don't have secure transactions legislation in place. And whatever approach will be adopted in the end, the guide to enactment that I mentioned earlier will explain how the model law relates to the secure transactions law regime and also elaborate on these aspects. So coming to our last point, the next steps under this project, there will be 2 more working group sessions before the draft model law will be submitted to intergovernmental negotiations within UNCITRAL in 2023. And it is expected that the final law and guide to enactment be approved by both organizations in 2024. And concluding with an outlook to the ex post international coordination, we of course hope that all the experts and organizations that have been contributing to this project will continue beyond the approval of the model law to coordinate their technical assistance for implementing the model law. This brings me to the end of my presentation. Thank you all for your attention. Back to you, Angelo.
Thank you very much, Philine, for this also comprehensive presentation of our work on warehouse receipts, which, as you also know, UNCITRAL very much looks forward to seeing completed at the UNIDROIT stage, so as to then be handed over to us for our intergovernmental deliberations on this. I understand that unfortunately Panos Varangis still has problems connecting. So, I also understand that Elaine MacEachern, who's actually also present, has kindly agreed to present the IFC work in this area. And then with my thanks to her, I would invite Elaine now to step in and present the work IFC on access to credit to agribusiness. Elaine, please.
Thank you so much, Angelo, and thanks to the panels, and my apologies on behalf of Panos, who's having some troubles connecting. But let me just maybe speak a little bit about some of the work that IFC has been doing in this space over the last recent years. It would have been nice if we did have Panos, because he's actually our global specialist on warehouse receipts and crop receipts financing in the ag space. But generally speaking, as part of the larger credit infrastructure program, and as you know, under the secure transactions law, both crop receipt and warehouse receipts are deemed to be negotiable instruments, and so therefore they can be used to access finance by farmers. So one of the things that we've been doing most recently is we've had quite a successful Ukraine crop receipts project that was implemented over the last 4 years. And actually the project just closed before the situation in the Ukraine had erupted, as it did earlier this year. And so the idea is to take that Ukraine crop receipts project as an example, and then replicate that in a number of other jurisdictions. So what we've been doing right now, in fact, is we're conducting a number of crop receipt feasibility studies in 5 or 6 different countries. That work is ongoing and will be wrapping up in December. And it's specifically looking at what is the what are the gaps in the enabling environment and what actually needs to be required in the broader ecosystem to facilitate both pre and post agri-finance, right? So we're talking about crop receipts and warehouse receipts. So those series of studies are happening. IFC in general had a large warehouse receipts program for a large number of years. And then that had wrapped up due to donor funding, I know, a few years ago, but we're looking at revamping that and doing a lot more work. So that's a little bit about just what's going on currently in the crop receipt space. We also are just interesting enough doing a little bit of piloting where we're integrating warehouse receipts registries into the collateral registries, right? So we're doing that as an experiment in Ethiopia, for example, and we're trying to do that in a couple of other countries. So some of the larger issues with that, of course, is we go back to this issue of capacity on the ground on a regular basis. So it's one thing to have the electronic warehouse receipt, but then it's another thing to be able to register in the registry. But if you don't have the warehouses, right, fundamentally, that's the problem. So you need to have those warehouses that can be either regulated properly, and if they're going to be used for certain types of commodities, so whether maybe it needs to be a temperature controlled environment, so they need cold storage, or whatever that might look like. Having the capacity for those types of things to be in place is also part and parcel of putting the overall agri-finance program together. Now, when in countries where we talk about introducing these types of financing arrangements, particularly in those economies that are heavily agrarian economies, if we think places like Malawi and other places like that, right, where we do a lot of the work, the challenge is implementing that with and getting on board financial institutions to actually introduce that type of financing product to the market. They deem to be highly risky. And there's a number of reasons for that. And one of the underlying requests from the financial institutions, or from market players, as it were, is that they want to be able to underwrite the risk, right? So then we get into crop insurance type things. So if you don't have or public guarantee schemes, something to underwrite the risk on this particular type of financing product, then it becomes really difficult to try and implement that in the ground. And that's, I think, where it gets important for, as Teemu was mentioning, the idea of the anchor buyer coming in and providing that finance, because the financial institutions themselves and the microfinance institutions are not really willing to step up and provide that financing where it's really needed. And we know that, and I thought it was an interesting comment also that Teemu had on his slide, just in talking about, the risk is being over indebted, right? But I think the counter to that is it's greater financial inclusion if it can work, right? And so I think it's really important for us to continue to push these types of agendas, but also understand that it needs to be married with other things to underwrite the risk. And working part and parcel with others that are working in this space, like FAO and others, I think is critically important. So I think maybe I'll just stop there. And on behalf of Panos, I'm sure he's sending his regrets, and he wishes that he would have been able to attend. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elaine. And I think your presentation also was a perfect bridge between Philine's and Marek's presentation. But before I give Marek the floor, I simply like to underline one point that you made, that also one added layer of complexity also of the project on warehouse receipt, if you wish, is that it touches upon also aspects not only beyond the negotiable instrument itself, that is a relationship between the parties and the elevators, what we would call in Latin in North America, or the warehouse operator, that is the bailment contract, but also significant regulatory consideration in terms of regulation of the industry, the standards to which they have to abide, controls, and the need for a functioning insurance industry surrounding that to make all these contracts operate and fill the gaps of financing. Now, thank you very much. Now, Marek, for your thoughts.
Thank you, Angelo, and thanks for having me on the panel, and thanks to the excellent presentations that preceded mine. In my presentation, I will focus on the cycle of agricultural financing, also outlining some of the challenges that I have seen in my work. I would begin with an observation that these days, the question might be different than in 2016-17, where local stakeholders and countries were asking, how do I facilitate access to credit in general? Because banks lend only against motor vehicles and land. So the solution was a general secure transactions law. Today, the question is slightly different. countries are asking, how do I facilitate this or that transaction? What components are needed, for instance, to facilitate the financing of a commodity as it moves through an agricultural chain, whether in an import or export transactions, and the solutions and answers might be different. So I would begin with an actual conversation that happened last Wednesday in Nairobi, where we met with the Warehouse Receipts Council. Kenya adopted a secure transactions law in 2017. It's listed on UNCITRAL's website as fully compatible with the UNCITRAL model law, but in 2019, it enacted the Warehouse Receipt System Act and established a pledge registry for receipts. So I think you need a footnote on the website to say that not really compatible anymore after these developments. So we met with the Warehouse Receipts Council, and the first question was to us, what is your additionality? And I'm asking them, like, what do you mean by additionality? Well, we provide this financing against receipts. So what added value do you provide in your law? So I'm thinking about it for like a few seconds, and what added value do you provide? I mean, we came first, 2017. It's a comprehensive system. All the stakeholders agreed. There was a policy approach, and then a law was enacted. The second question was to us, oh, it's your problem. How do you solve this problem? How is this my problem? I mean, you've been going around telling the banks they could finance commodities, they could just register pledges in their warehouse receipts registry, completely disregarding the secure transactions law and the collateral registry. How do you tell them what they need to do to achieve priority? Because you have two laws with two separate perfection regimes and no priority systems. So I guess it's your problem at the end of the day. So after 3 hours, we came to some agreement as to how to proceed forward and resolve any challenges for the lenders, because at the end of the day, we want to make sure that there is lending to the agriculture sector in Kenya. But this is just an illustration of what is happening on the ground and what sort of coordinating challenges the network itself may look at. Access to finance is becoming extremely relevant in the context of broader global issues, particularly food security. Many countries around the world are facing droughts. They import most of their wheat from Russia and Ukraine. 60% of wheat in Africa comes from these two countries. Actually, 21 of them import all of their wheat from the Ukraine and Russia, which obviously now has been disrupted. Many countries in Africa provide food subsidies or bread subsidies to their populations. So this may also create social problems. So agricultural finance has become has gained quite an importance in light of addressing some of these problems, and it has been recognized as such by essentially all financial and international organizations and financial institutions sitting in the room. So I have just collected a few quotes from the World Bank, FAO, UNCTAD, and ADB, all recognizing that support for agricultural, what some of them may call rural finance, is an important tool to alleviate food insecurity and the challenges in that aspect. So that brings us to what is it that we are able to do and how do we help in solving some of these challenges? Well, of course, the network itself and us in the room have certain tools that can alleviate some of those problems, but there are, of course, other laws, regulations, free trade agreements that address some other aspects. But of course, there is something that us can do together. And we have several instruments, international instruments that facilitate, to some extent, agricultural financing. It's the UNCITRAL model law on secure transactions, which is a comprehensive law on security rights, model law on electronic transferable records that deals with instruments and documents of title that may cover commodities that are stored in warehouses. And Philine explained the status of a model on warehouse receipts, which is a an ongoing project, and we have also a project on factoring, model on factoring, as Teemu was explaining, and, the uses of contract farming and referring to lien on future revenues. Those would be essentially receivables, future receivables that would be financed under a local law on factoring. So there is a great deal of connection not only between warehouse receipts and contract farming, because a commodity that is subject to a contract very likely is deposited into a warehouse before it is shipped out or sold, and then generates a receivable. So we have now 3 different regimes that might need to be coordinated with one another to actually enable the local farmer to collect the payment from a local or a foreign buyer. There are also some regulatory aspects which are important, and Angelo referred to them. For instance, there is this IOSCO guide on commodity storage and delivery infrastructure. So they have actually put out some standards in this space to guide the warehouse operators as to how they should establish and run their warehouses that deliver commodities on commodity exchanges. So all of these, the existence of and proliferation of all of these instruments led some stakeholders to realize, well, perhaps it's time to bring everything together and to actually explain to a stakeholder what is it that needs to be done to facilitate that agricultural finance transaction. And thanks to UNIDROIT for accepting a proposal to develop a agricultural legal financing guide that would put all these and many other instruments, which I have omitted, together and explain to the stakeholder. Either you have enacted a secure transactions law along the UNCITRAL standards, and these are the provisions of that law that apply to a transaction step by step, or here are some other international standards which you may wish to consider for adoption, and this is how they facilitate the agricultural financing transaction. There is obviously a number of guides that have been already published in this space, some of them by the World Bank and IFC, some of them by FAO that Teemu mentioned in his presentation. And actually following up on what Elaine said with respect to guarantee schemes, there are also guides that provide some guidance as to how agricultural financing may be supported by regulatory measures, some of which Angelo also mentioned himself. As for instance, I was doing an assessment in the Philippines a couple of years ago for USAID and came across a central bank regulation that required financial institutions to lend at least 10% of their loan book to the agriculture sector. If they didn't, they would pay some penalties. Well, they happily paid the penalties because the risk of lending to the agriculture sector was more significant in terms of potential losses that they can incur. And this is a situation in many countries around the world. There's Pakistan, Ethiopia, and several other countries that have these agricultural lending quotas, and those quotas have not been met. So putting together proper guidance on the legal as well as regulatory measures may actually help these countries not only meet their quotas, but actually facilitate commercial agricultural financing. So here's just a sampling of the credit products, some of which have been already mentioned by my co-panelists, that a guide should cover and explain to the relevant stakeholders what laws and regulations are needed to enable these products. Secured agriculture production loans. This is the kind of loan that Teemu was describing in his presentation, the provision of seeds and anything that is required to actually grow the crop. That's for us a classical secure transaction for which, yes, you may need some contract farming framework, but a general secure transactions law will protect the buyer against any risk and losses that are incurred during the growing process. Elaine mentioned crop receipts finance and the success in Ukraine. And actually, when we worked for the EBRD in 2018 on the warehouse receipts legislation, we came across the crop receipts legislation, which was just enacted at the time, but Ukraine has a 2002 pledge law with its own registry. It has a crop receipts registration system, and it was creating a warehouse receipts registration system. So again, it's a good development that countries are thinking how to facilitate pre and post-harvest financing. But at the end of the day, they may end up with 3 different laws and 3 registration systems for which, like in Kenya, you may not have a priority rule, as a result of which no financing will be extended. Contract farming was already covered by Teemu. Equipment leases, I should just mention that UNIDROIT also has a model law on leasing that covers mainly equipment. So there is, and as well as the MAC protocol, the Pretoria protocol from 2019 that covers the financing and leasing of agricultural equipment. So that's another important component with its own bespoke legal regime that ought to be covered and guidance provided on it. There is a recent shift towards digitalization of various credit products. And I should just mention 2, crop receipts and warehouse receipts. The main function of a crop receipt is to provide financing to the grower, but at the same time, since it is a negotiable type of a document, it enables the credit provider to actually sell it in the secondary market. Same with warehouse receipts that are increasingly issued electronically. And many countries have already established platforms and exchanges for electronic warehouse receipts, including Ethiopia, Malawi was mentioned earlier, but also increasingly in Asia. And some of these exchanges operate based on a contractual framework in light of the absence of a property law framework that actually protects those who transact on these exchanges. So the warehouse receipts model law, any legislation that clarifies the rights of a crop receipt credit provider is useful also in the sense of establishing these secondary markets, which was an aspect that was highlighted earlier in the first panel. So I guess this is okay. This brings us to the end of my presentation. This must have slipped in from my other presentation, but it's a good segue to the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marek. And I think this was an excellent conclusion of this panel, because you draw on a lot of what the previous speakers had addressed. Before we move to questions, I don't see anyone here in the chat, and you need to be helped by anyone who's controlling those who are in the room asking questions. Maybe I can just use my prerogative as chair and ask the panel for their views on 2 things. One is, what would be, in your view, the specific design needs for a warehouse receipt or even crop receipt, but probably more for warehouse receipts legislation, depending on the existence of a secondary securitization market in the country, or whether the warehouse receipts will be used mainly for foreign trade finance. Do you see a difference in the way the legislation or the surrounding environment will be structured, or the conditions for success of a law reform in this area? That's the one point. And the second point that I'll be interested in hearing from you is, as you see this continuous trend towards the move towards electronic warehouse receipt systems and electronic warehouse receipts registries, how prevalent still is, in your experience, the paper-based receipt, and what role do you see in the future for receipts issued to the order of the holder, and instead of receipts, nominal receipts to the benefit of a named person? So who would like to?
I was going to yield the floor to Philine, but she's pointing at me, so I'll start with some observations. So let me start out with your second question, Angelo, which concerns the existence of paper receipts. Many laws on warehouse receipts have been enacted around the world, but not in a sense of covering all commodities, but covering specific types of commodities for which only electronic warehouse receipts are issued, which would be the case of coffee or some of the grains. And the general warehouse receipts legislation that we are drafting here as a joint project between the two institutions, and as has been enacted around the world, still provides for paper receipts, because the commodity trades or the types of goods that are covered by warehouse receipts may not be just agricultural commodities, maybe ordinary inventory, may have different practices developed so as to accommodate those practices and facilitate a transition to electronic warehouse receipts. There may or may still not be a need to provide for rules that govern the transfers of paper receipts, which, as you know, we have done, however, highlighting more the benefits of fully electronic system. But I guess it's a type of transition that may take a bit of time, just like with collateral registries, for which we had dual systems. But these days, even Liberia has a collateral registry that is accessible only by electronic means. As to your second question concerning nominal and negotiable receipts, nominal receipts that are non-negotiable receipts are issued primarily in large transactions where you have a collateral manager that issues some kind of a receipt to document the movement of inventory in and out of the warehouse. The financing of that nature could occur without the receipt itself, so it's more for documenting the movement of commodities. So it still is a practice, and actually some laws and regulations, such as in Pakistan, cover warehouse receipts and collateral managers, and that the collateral management bit precisely relates to nominative or non-negotiable receipts. And as to the first question on local and foreign, of course, we want to facilitate both types of transactions, and some commodities are sold locally, some are sold internationally. The local transaction is much simpler. The foreign transaction requires, as I was explaining, the movement through various steps in the value chain, which may add some components, some processing to it. So I see an increasing role of warehouse receipts in cross-border and foreign transactions, and not relating only to agricultural products. For instance, when we were working on a warehouse receipts law in the Ukraine for the EBRD, the law was supposed to apply to gas and oil, which was destined for exports. So depending on the needs of countries and the types of commodities and goods that they trade in, the warehouse receipts may perform different functions, but the point is that local law should enable those transactions. Thank you.
Thank you. And I wonder whether Eileen would have, and also after Philine, of course, but also whether Eileen also would have some views on this question of warehouse receipts legislation and market structure.
Thank you, Angelo, for putting me on the spot. Yeah, I mean, just to sort of pick up, I think, on what Marek was mentioning, right? It's the coordination between these various laws and registries, right? We often see this as a problem area, and then to convince the relevant stakeholders that there is a need for more uniformity and harmonization in order, I think, one, to get a more effective overall enabling environment in place to facilitate these types of transactions, but also to try and get the various stakeholders that are owners of those particular legislative frameworks and registry databases, who may be sitting in very different ministries, to collaborate is extremely challenging, right? And there's a whole host of reasons, why they might be resistant to change. So having kind of said that, what we've seen in a number of places, and it sort of goes back to your first question in terms of the level of sort of paper-based registry, or paper-based receipts rather, and then moving to this electronic environment, you are seeing some opportunities where you can leapfrog from sort of this old school paper-based environment into this new electronic environment. But then in order for that to happen, you have to have a number of other things in place in the broader ecosystem to support that. So maybe there is a need for, say, Electronic Signatures Act, or the electronic submission of documents, or the recognition that that electronic paper is, has the legal weight that it needs to have. And so there's some considerations, I think, in that respect also that need to be factored into this. And then also, I think, just generally speaking, typically when we're trying to implement these programs, at least what I've observed over the last few years is, jurisdictions want to copy from other jurisdictions, right? And so it's to identify the jurisdictions that have the best practices that you want to replicate in your beneficiary jurisdiction that you're working in. And so trying to facilitate that knowledge exchange and transfer is really important in terms of helping to get the buy-in for those reforms at that level. And so if you take the example of Ukraine, for example, where it's got these multiplicity of these registries, there are aspects of that project that were done really well. But then, as Marek has pointed out, and we, absolutely know, there are other aspects of that could have been done a little bit better. And probably if there would have been a way to seamlessly create one centralized database for these kinds of things, that would have happened. But as you would know yourself, you need to have the political will in order for that to actually happen. And so all the stakeholders have to buy into that. So there's a lot of challenges that are in play when you're trying to move these reforms through the process. And it's not just whether or not the receipt itself is, in some kind of paper format, but also moving into an electronic environment. And then what's the capacity of that one, the institution, and the overall use of technology to deliver some of those kinds of services, and at the very basic level, the infrastructure, right? Do they actually have connectivity? So I've got a project in one of the countries. We have this beautiful piece of secure transactions legislation and this nice little registry, but they can't pay the monthly internet bill to keep the registry operational. I mean, those are the basics that you're challenged with working in some countries. So then taking that up a notch to then look at the warehouse receipts and then trying to do the work around that space even gets a little bit more complicated, because you're dealing with, in some instances, farmers who are not necessarily as conversant in some of these things as you would like, say, when you're working with secure transactions legislation, you're working with a financial institution and the legal practitioners. So the level of knowledge and the way that you engage with those stakeholders at that level has to be very, very different. So maybe I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you. Philine?
Thank you, Angelo. Maybe just to add that on your question regarding paper-based receipts versus electronic warehouse receipts, it depends on the agricultural producer. Of course, for contract farming, it is even hard to convince the farmer to enter into a written contract. I mean, this is the level of what we speak about. Warehouse receipts, I think it's easier. I think it also depends on the commodity. So if you have perishable commodities that are traded quickly, the status changes quickly, the advantages of an electronic warehouse receipts are enormous, because it can update automatically. It shows the status where it is, and it follows quickly without any cumbersome paper transfer. Now, one comment: when you work in a country and you talk to stakeholders, often the issue of the regulatory framework is raised, which is even more in the focus than the private law side that we were talking about, and that the small law on warehouse receipts is about. So of course you have to take this into account, meaning regulatory framework, meaning the licensing and supervision of warehouses, performance guarantees for warehouses, which you mentioned, insurance schemes for possibly penalties and comedies, and the administration of the entire system. So this is, of course, not within the scope of this project, but as this interrelates, the guide to enactment will address this and also provides guidance, for example, on the registry, etc. So all those aspects that you have to take into consideration when you look at the broader picture of a warehouse receipt system. Thank you.
Thank you. Do you have any questions from the floor? I see none on the chat. I could go on playing the moderator and animator of this session. I see no question. Then, well, it seems that I have to at least a few more minutes, because we can't stop this session 25 minutes before the agreed hour. But perhaps one or two aspects that perhaps the panelists could further elaborate on is, and that has to do with also with the regulatory environment and the need for a competent warehousing industry in the country, and that is the risk of shortfall. I mean, there's a certain level which is remains within the acceptable wastage rate for whatever commodity or special agricultural commodity is being warehoused, even if it's warehoused to the best possible conditions. But then there may be shortages that are due just to improper operation of the warehouse. And one can think of merely bonding and requirements and insurance schemes, or also for shortage rule, for example, as one knows from securities trading, for instance, if one think of the Geneva Securities Convention. What are your views on that, and what the models that are being more often implemented? And so with that, and also I see that we have a request from the floor from Mark Walter. Perhaps I give him the floor first to ask his question, and then you take note of mine. Thank you. Mark, please.
Thank you very much. Just a very brief, quick note that I'm very much in favor of tools and instruments like what you're talking about up here at the development level. And I think specifically referring to contract farming, I think contract farming could be provided an incredibly substantial inroad into things like the amazing food waste that we experience at the agricultural level and food security, et cetera. But one of the big challenges is at the agreement level. You know, as you said, Teemu, the farmers are risk averse, but they don't understand. In fact, traders at that level also hardly understand that contracts, agreements are just risk allocation tools. And they look at them as something entirely different. And so these tools, and in my experience, and particularly in Asia, contract farming really struggles. Input providers don't want to risk the loss of their inputs. Farmers don't want to risk having to wait for a contract to come to term. They just sell their product right out from under the input or credit provider. And so that's where everything breaks down. But at the principle level, at the theoretical level, these tools are, I think, groundbreaking and world changing, potentially.
Okay, I take it that this was not a question addressed to any specific member of the panel.
I'm happy to respond to that as well.
Yeah.
It would be, I'd love to hear your response from FAO. Yeah.
Yeah, because yes, I fully agree. Contract farming is one of those instruments that when it works really well. But the struggle we're doing in our day-to-day projects, where we go to countries, where we talk to farmers, where we talk to the local buyers and the local possessors. In every country we've worked so far, the first things we're told is people don't want to enter into a contract. They see it as a trap. They see that the other party, particularly farmers, they consider that if I write my name on a piece of paper, it is somehow going to be used against me. And that is a very difficult challenge that we're trying to slowly overcome, and that we're doing through trying to facilitate pilot projects, assist in the contract negotiations, organize capacity building workshops, so that we try and help to create the conditions for it actually to work on. But that being said, issues like side selling that you were mentioning, that that farmers take inputs and they opportunistically sell, they emerge. and they are often deal breakers as well. And an additional challenge is that particularly if we're trying to contract with multiple small farmers, the transaction costs for any kind of a buyer will go through the roof rapidly. Some of the responses, some of the ways we have tried to alleviate this is to pool the farmers first together, to producer organizations that can, first of all, exert internal pressure to align with the contract, because if my neighboring farmer messes up, it affects my future as well as to try to create the economies of scale so that we can start to cut down the transaction costs. But as long as these keep operating on a contract with an individual farmer who will not feel like they have their voice heard, we will run into the issues that you mentioned. But it's nevertheless a massive challenge, because the starting position always is, I don't want a contract, that's a trap.
Thank you, Teemu. We have two requests from the floor and one from James Kashangak from FSD Kenya. Perhaps I'll give him the chance first, and then I'll turn to Anna Veneziana and Germain Trammell.
Thank you. Fascinating panel. Obviously, I've been involved in Kenya for a long time, and I've been involved in trying to get credit solutions developed since 2006. Huge trust deficit that exists throughout credit markets, and that's a major problem to overcome. And I'm not sure we've cracked it yet. And so introducing these instruments, I think, as the previous speaker said, is a great thing, but without really concentrating on how to overcome the trust deficit that exists between all the players. And it may be, and in FSD Kenya, certainly, we try very hard to understand what the demand side is doing and what they want before we go ahead and implement something. I think understanding their own trust resolution systems much better would help us to develop instruments that play along with the cultural idiosyncrasies that go along. We can't implement what works in New York or Chicago in Africa or any developing country. We need to take into account what their particular ways of dealing with these things are. So yeah, I mean, I'm just making that statement to add to what was said before, and I think you already tried to answer that.
Thank you very much. I asked the panelists perhaps when they give their answers and they made their final remarks also to also react to that. And now I'll move then to Anna Veneziana, please.
Thank you, Angelo. I actually had a different question, but allow me to make a very short comment on this last exchange, which was particularly interesting. When we look at the legal guide on contract farming, one element to underline, which Teemu underlined, is that this is conceived as a general guidance, but then the whole idea of this kind of soft guidance instrument is that implementation should be done at a much more granular level within regions or even specific states or legal systems. So this is a very good point to take into account. The work only starts when you have such a general instrument, and then you go on with implementation, which underlines the importance of the coordination with the implementing organizations. And the legal guide itself then tries to address some of the issues, for example, in the chapter on parties, by underlining the importance of the cooperatives, for example, or facilitators, and in the part on dispute resolution, by trying to show that there are ways to overcome the aversion to going in front of a court or to decide matters in a more formal way by including participation of representatives of the different parties in panels, for example, to solve problems, which might add some element of trust, which of course is still a big problem. But my question was actually a bit different and more general, and it relates to the coordination with the general secure transactions best practices that were already developed. So I think Marek already touched upon that, but since when we discussed the factoring model law, it was Will expressly said that there might be different stages of implementation in a specific legal system. And how would you see the model, how would you see the model law on warehouse receipts fitting into this idea of a possible gradual development towards accepting a more coordinating general framework in line with the general best practices? I think you address some of those issues, but it might be relevant. Thank you.
May I ask Jeanette to ask her question, and then you go to a round for the speakers. Begin with Mark, to whom this last question was addressed. Jeanette, please.
Thank you, Angelo. Yes, in other sectors, particularly in the energy sector, we see an interest very rapidly in green financing. And so I'm wondering if, and so theoretically, obviously, we can think about connections, making connections to these various financing instruments in terms of encouraging a shift towards green financing. I'm just wondering if anyone in the panel has thoughts on this. For example, being able to make connections between the financing and good agricultural practices. If you have any thoughts on that or any examples, that would be my question. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. We have no more questions there. I might ask the panelists to make their final remarks and address in particular the points that are raised. I'll begin by Marek, as I said, because Anna addressed a question specifically to him.
Thank you, Angelo. Yes, Anna, to your question, and actually it's a good question that connects to what James said about how to overcome the lack of trust, as well as what Angelo asked in his initial question about what happens to a shortfall. So there are certain mechanisms that enable financing. Why countries look to warehouse receipts laws and factoring laws as a starting point? Well, because the trust deficit is lower in those kinds of transactions, and the risks are lower in those kinds of transactions. You already have goods stored in a warehouse that is typically bonded and independent. So the trust issue, you trust basically a private sector operator and trust the system under which the warehouse operator functions. When you have ordinary livestock financing, well, you trust the farmer. So the trust divide is much larger. So warehouse receipts and factoring laws are basically the starting blocks that enable this kind of financing, because the trust and risk issues are the least in those kinds of transactions. So this is an answer to your question. And building on that, Angelo asked specifically about some of these regulatory and shortfall aspects. And again, it's a trust question. These issues are either addressed through public measures. Many countries have established these public guarantee funds, or some private measures such as insurance. It works similarly, as he said, to the securities industry. And then in some countries, you trust the public authority. In some other countries, you don't trust the public authority. So in the specific project in the Ukraine, the Ministry of Agriculture was sort of the chief regulator, providing that trust support in the market, but the market players didn't trust the Ministry of Agriculture, so they wanted to create a private sector mechanism to make a more comfortable lending in the market against warehouse receipts. So basically, we have the tools to reinforce the trust in certain kinds of transactions where it might be easier as opposed to other types of transactions, but those mechanisms may vary country by country. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, Teemu?
Yeah, so I'll respond to the trust and the implementation, as well as the question on the green financing, because we can tie those more or less together. Whenever we go to work in a country, and as Anna was saying, this legal guide is a very high concept document. And what we have been doing ever since it was published is go to the countries and try to translate those international best practices into national best practice, into something that works in the national context. And the only way we can do that is by intensive stakeholder consultation and participation. And this is also one of the tools that we have for the trust deficit issue. Because the first question we ask, for example, if we go to a very granular level, if we talk about a pilot project with farmers and a potential buyer, the first question we ask who do you trust? If a dispute arises, who would you trust to solve this dispute? And that answer is always different in different countries, in different scenarios. So we are keenly aware of both the trust deficit issue, as well as the fact that whatever is within the legal guide, while working at the global level, will always need to be adjusted to work at the national level or a local level. In relation to the green, the green financing, while it's not an inherent part of what could be in contract farming agreement, it is not a theoretical exercise either. Through these forward agreements, different conditions can be placed. And as sustainability considerations start to become more and more relevant for the final consumer, it is in the interest of the buyer, of the retailer, of the processor, to make sure that the products that they get are produced in a socially or environmentally sustainable manner. And instead of having to go to expensive third-party certifiers, they can draft the contract in a way that they require certain practices to be used or certain practices not to be used, so that they have more direct control over the production practices. So it can be incorporated, and we have seen it particularly used by when international supermarket chains and retailers enter into contracting agreements with usually larger cooperatives. These tend to be included in it so that they have a lever to make sure that the consumers get goods produced in a way that they want them to be produced.
Thank you very much, Teemu. Philine, would you like to add a quick word at the end to wrap up?
Yes, thank you, Angelo. Very quickly, I would comment on 3 points very quickly. The first one, this a trust problem. I think this can be targeted at different levels. So one is when you go into a country and you work on legal reform, to structure the process in a way that all the players are involved. So they got to know about it, they got familiar with the product, and those are the actual users of the system afterwards. Then this can be, of course, supplemented by capacity building. There are the mechanisms that you can build into the law, such as the performance guarantees, insurance schemes. And then you have to take into account the institutional setup and where do you want to establish registries, etc. So there are different levels that you can work towards building trust. The second issue is, I think this discussion showed actually that even if this is a model law that can be turned into national legislation, you always need to take the broader context into account of a given country and to tailor the law to the economic, legal, social context of a particular country, which is more relevant for the regulatory part, which is more resource dependent, etc. But still, overall, you have to take this into account. And the last point, which was referred to several times today, but rather tangentially, but I think it's very important right now in view of food insecurity, following COVID, following the war in Ukraine, that there are very important benefits for a well-functioning warehouse receipt system to improve food security, such as increasing the agricultural production through access to credit, inputs, reducing food waste through better storage and treatment facilities, enhancing the distribution of the agricultural product and food at country level, and then also to enable the government to take stock of all the food reserve at the national level. And this is the end of my comments. Thank you, Angelo. Back to you.
Thank you very much. We have actually exceeded the time allocated to us, but I think everybody would agree that we had excellent presentations, a very useful discussion, and also a panel that shows that even though coordination, different levels of law reform, general security transaction-specific legislation is sometimes difficult, we have also examples of successful integrated approach in terms of offering best practice standards to promote law reform. Thank you all very much, and especially thank you for giving the privilege to chair this panel. Back to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Angelo, for moderating remotely, which is not an easy undertaking when you have all of the panelists and the questions in the room. We're extremely grateful for your efforts as always. Wonderful job. So we're only slightly behind